Afternoon, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to be here as President of the International League Against Epilepsy, to be here to co-present this webinar with the World Federation for Neurology and also the International Bureau for Epilepsy on really addressing where we are after 1 year of the Intersectoral Global Action Plan. We really want to explore what each of us have been doing in order to try and move forward for the next 10-year plan. For this, we have 4 speakers that we hope will illustrate where we are, with the possibility of questions and answers for a further 30 minutes after the hour, for which we hope you will be able to put questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we can moderate the session amongst the panelists thereafter. Briefly, I will just hand over to Wolfgang Grisold, President of the World Federation for Neurology, to give a brief introduction.
Thank you very much, Helen. And my name is Wolfgang Grisold. I'm a neurologist from Vienna, Austria, and President of the World Federation of Neurology. I think it's a delightful occasion that the ILAE and the IBE and the World Federation have a joint seminar 1 year after the introduction of the WHA on IGAP. As we know, this is a rare occasion for neurology and for patients, for the structure, for anyone you like. And we really have to take care and use this opportunity that is given or is indicated by the WHO worldwide. I also want to state, and I will say this in my talk, that it's a 10-year project, and we're already in the 2nd year. So it is important to see what is happening and how we can proceed. So I'm looking forward to this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So to start our webinar, it gives me great pleasure in presenting Professor Alla, Professor of Neurology in Moscow, but also Treasurer of the International League Against Epilepsy, Chair of the Advocacy Council, and also a Trustee of the World Federation for Neurology, to give an introduction as to where we were and to where we've come. Alla.
Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this webinar. And next slide, please. We will discuss why the IGAP have been created, how it happened, what is the key milestones which led us to the formation of the IGAP, and what is the main content of the Sectorial Global Action Plan on Epilepsy and other neurological disorders. So, next slide, please. Indeed, epilepsy has been known to mankind for more than 3,000 years. And since that time, it has been the subject of misunderstanding, ignorance, and stigma, adding to the burden of those who suffer from this condition in many areas of the globe. There are many tragic examples from history, literature, and art. In ancient times, people with epilepsy were believed to be possessed by evil spirits. During the medieval time, epilepsy has been as a form of witchcraft or demonic possession. And even at present time, stigma surrounding epilepsy can lead to social, next slide please, to social isolation and exclusion. People with epilepsy may be subjected to negative attitudes, stereotypes, and avoidance by others. Many studies demonstrated that stigma has a significant negative impact on quality of life. Next slide, please. At present, as presented at the Global Report for Epilepsy, there are numerous barriers for people with epilepsy in the most important areas of life, including restrictions at school, marriage, and many others. People with epilepsy often face discrimination in the workplace and limited career advancement opportunities due to misconception and fear regarding this condition. Next slide, please. Indeed, epilepsy carries a high risk of premature death, which is up to 3 times higher than for the general population. It affects people of all ages, races, social classes, and geographic locations. It's highly comorbid to many neurological disorders. People with epilepsy face devastating social consequences. Epilepsy research could really serve as a window to the brain function and dysfunction. And indeed, epilepsy could serve as a very valuable entry point for other neurological disorders. Importantly, during the recent years, major milestones have been achieved at regional and global levels, highlighting the importance of epilepsy as a public health imperative and paving the way to the intersectorial global action plan on epilepsy and other neurological disorders. Next slide, please. Now, to make the long story short, I will address only the key milestones. Next, please. Indeed, it was the goal of the global campaign against epilepsy to address the neglect and injustice by raising awareness, increasing education, and improving services to reduce the treatment gap and bring epilepsy out of the shadows. Global campaign against epilepsy was born owing to the vision of four outstanding persons: Professor Ted Reynolds, at that time the ILAE president, Ms. Hanneke de Boer, IB president, Dr. Leonid Prilipko, the head of the section for neuroscience at the WHO, and Dr. Shishuli, the chairman of the WHO executive board. And now it's a real privilege to be in touch and collaborate with Professor Lee and Professor Reynolds. Next slide, please. The first years of the global campaign were focused on raising awareness, creating acceptance, and promoting education. Over the subsequent years, the global campaign unfolded, resulting in the adoption of epilepsy declaration in all 6 WHO regions. We're indeed standing on the shoulders of giants, and I would like to acknowledge the great role of Professor Peter Wolf at this stage. I was fortunate to be involved in the meeting in Heidelberg as a very young neurologist at that time. And indeed, there was a huge enthusiasm. And the messages of the declarations are excellent and they are valid until now. However, soon it became obvious that we need a vehicle to implement the brilliant declarations and brilliant ideas. Next slide, please. The resolution of the 68th World Health Assembly was a landmark event and the culmination of the years of the collaborative efforts among ILAE, IB, WHO, and the member states. 19 countries co-sponsored the resolution and 43 made a very strong statement in favor. And I would like to highlight the role of Professor Miro Peruka, Tanos Kovanis, and Shishuli. Next slide, please. The major milestone of the following years was the Global Report on Epilepsy, the prominent document produced by the WHO, ILAE, and the IB. It highlights the evidence of the burden of epilepsy and promoted epilepsy as a public health imperative. Next, please. There was indeed a long and winding road to the IGAP. May I invite you to read the paper which published with Professor Sam Bibe, at the time the ILAE president, and our esteemed colleagues who contributed very much to this accomplishment. The 73rd World Health Resolution was really a remarkable achievement, accomplished at the challenging time of pandemic. The action plan began to materialize, and the role of the WHO Department of Mental Health and its brain health unit, led by Deborah Castell and Tarun Dua, couldn't be overestimated. I would like to note that it was the birth of the document on epilepsy and other neurological disorders, underlying the notion of epilepsy as one of the key neurological diseases and reflecting the excellent collaboration between the ILAE and the WFN. And I would like to thank sincerely Professor Bill Carroll and Wolfgang Grisold, the previous and current presidents of the WFN, and Professor Stan Wiebe and Helen Cross, the previous and the current presidents of the ILAE. Next slide, please. We will focus on the action plan, especially on its strategic objectives and indicators, which are the vehicle missing in the previous documents and the instrument for developing tools requiring for the implementation of IGAP. Next slide, please. As you know, in May 2022, the World Health Assembly unanimously approved a 10 years intersectorial global action plan on epilepsy and other neurological disorders, which with 116 countries unanimously spoke in favor. Statements of the ILAE, IB, and WFN presented by Helen Cross, Mary Sepp, and Wolfgang Grisold and the pivotal role of the WHO Brain Health Unit. 5 conditions were noted as key contributors to the burden of neurological disorders, including stroke, migraine, meningitis, and epilepsy. Dementia, And in fact, as presented in the recent paper by the WFN, it is a unique opportunity for neurology across the globe. The backbone of IGAP are 10 strategic objectives and 10 targets, which we will address. Next slide, please. IGAP is focused on the brain health, and notably, one of the WHO position papers heralding the era of the IGAP implementation was the position paper on the brain health. IGAP is a trigger for improving prevention and care for all neurological disorders, and the WHO technical brief was already published on Parkinson's disease and definitely in epilepsy. The goal of the landmark document, the IGAP, is to reduce the burden of neurological disorders and its stigma associated with mortality and morbidity, and to improve the quality of life of people with epilepsy and other neurological disorders. And I would like to highlight that there is an important notion of synergy and entry points. Next slide, please. The first strategic objective is addressing prioritization and strengthening governance. I would like to mention that one of the predecessors of IGAP, PAHO Action Plan on Epilepsy, founded in 2012, is really very important, and it also addressed governance and legislation. When the PAHO Action Plan was adopted, only a few countries, as you can see on the slide, had action plan on epilepsy in their national agenda. However, at the end of the PAHO Action Plan implementation, the majority of the targets in legislation have been either achieved or partially achieved. For instance, instead of 10 countries, 18 has epilepsy in their national agenda. Accordingly, to achieve the global targets 1.1 and 1.2, which are very ambitious, indeed 75 countries should have adopted or updated existing national policies, and 100 countries should have at least one functioning awareness campaign for neurological disorders. So to achieve these targets, we need to work at different levels. For instance, at policy level, at operational level, and the epilepsy technical brief highlights the need to train champions to communicate with governments and to build a network, which is highly relevant for all neurological disorders. Next slide, please. The second strategic objective, urge member states and other stakeholders to provide effective, timely, and responsible diagnosis, treatment, and care. Indeed, 75% of countries should include neurological disorders in the USG benefit packages. And indeed, universal health care is extremely important, and it is very much corresponding with their UN's Sustainable Developmental Goals. Number 3, to ensure a healthy lifestyle and promote well-being at all ages. Also, 80% of countries should provide the essential medicines and basic technologies required to manage neurological disorders in primary care. So I would like to highlight that importantly, for instance, the treatment gap of epilepsy and other neurological disorders is extremely high in mostly low and middle income countries, and it should also be the focus of the IGAP implementation. Among the numerous and multi-sectoral strategies to foster IGAP implementations are increasing funding, availability of medicines, and developing the models of care. And I'm sure our eminent presidents will address their strategies of implementation ongoing. Next, please. The strategic objective 3 is focused on prevention with the need to have at least one intersectoral program by 2021. Importantly, 25% of epilepsies are preventable, especially epilepsies due to perinatal insult, stroke, and TBI. And the same is in many other neurological conditions. And indeed, it requires multi-sectorial approach with interactions with the policymakers, collaboration with the area of NCD, and, for instance, stroke community. Fostering research to develop further exciting new advances that suggest that there might be novel approaches to prevent, for instance, epilepsy after TBI and many other neurological conditions. Prevention of all neurological diseases is the major research and medical unmet need. Next slide, please. Strategic Objective 4 foster member states to increase research and innovation, strengthen the informational system. And indeed, by 2031, 80% of countries should routinely collect and report a core set of indicators. And the output of global research in neurological disorders should double by 2031. We are indeed currently seeing huge advances in neuroscience, including studies on epileptogenesis, cognitive neuroscience, artificial intelligence, brain-computer interface, neuroimplants, neurostimulation, regeneration techniques, genomics, precision medicines, and many other areas of neuroscience. However, as you can see, research in many neurological conditions, including epilepsy, is dramatically underfunded all over the globe, and we definitely need to address it. Next slide, please. The epilepsy community is really proud that the Strategic Objective 5 is focused on epilepsy, and member states are requested to strengthen the public health approach to epilepsy. And indeed, in 2031, many countries should increase service coverage for epilepsy by 50%, and 80% of countries should have developed or updated their legislation, the importance of which cannot be overestimated. It is indeed a well-deserved target to be one of the strategic objectives for neurological community. And as stated in the IGAP, well-focusing neurological epilepsy care could be a valuable entry point for many neurological disorders. The epilepsy technical brief highlights numerous multifactorial and interrelated strategies. The actual plans will be presented by Helen and Francesca Sofia, the ILAE and IB presidents. Next slide, please. When should it all happen? Next, please. For epilepsy, for instance, there is an established timeline with acceleration plan of closing treatment, inclusion, and research gap, midterm review, and evaluation close to 2031. And then hopefully we will discuss the next step and definitely implement them. Next slide, please. And finally, I would like to quote a paper in Nature authored by leaders of many neurological organizations and presenting the neurological quadrangle, which could provide a framework for the implementation of IGAP to improve brain health and well-being across the lifespan. This quadrangle consists of 4 pillars: surveillance, prevention, rehabilitation and treatment, and acute care. And it has a core on strengthening health system and resources by workplace training and capacity building and prioritization of neurological disorders. Indeed, we struggled for IGAP for 25 years. Now there is 1 year after IGAP has been implemented, and we have all chances to implement it until 2021. Indeed, I would like to address again that IGAP is a unique opportunity for neurology across the globe and to improve brain health for all people suffering from neurological conditions, their families, their caregivers, and for all their people in their world. Next slide, please. And with that, I would like to thank you sincerely for your kind attention and for the invitation. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the next eminent speaker, who is a professor of neurology in Austria and the president of the World Federation of Neurology, Professor Wolfgang Grisold. Wolfgang, over to you.
Thank you, Alla. And there's hardly anything to say after your detailed explanation and also this very important historic development of the IGAP. And we are very pleased that the ILAE set these important steps, and we are all now participating with other neurologic diseases. Next one, next slide. So the World Federation of Neurology has 123 member societies across the world, which are distributed in 6 regions. And you can see here the logo of the AON, the Asian part, the European, the EAN, the American Federation of Neurological Societies from Latin America, the American Academy of Neurology, the AFAN, the African Academy of Neurology, and POUNS, which represents the Arabian part of the world. Next. You've seen this simplification of the topics, and I changed the pattern a little bit and tried to put it in one word. Advocacy is something that we have to do and bring news to anyone, to politicians, to our health systems, to the public. Treatment is something that is self-speaking, and we all know that worldwide, in particularly in low-income countries, there's little possibilities for treatment. Prevention is something that we mention, but prevention could be a huge benefactor in fighting disease. And of course, we have also innovation and research, which is important. And I think all of us sitting here as neurologists believe in innovation and research. And we have public health that is often underestimated by physicians, but public health and the importance of diseases is an important point. And then I put in a fingerprint, and I think that's what we expect to have in the future. Our activity on these parts of activities should leave a fingerprint and should leave a legacy. Next. So I've put the timeline on the left side, and it says IGAP 2020. This was the event from last year. And if you look down on the right side, you see IGAP 2031, and we have 10 years in between. And you can see here that there's also 2 years, not completely, but 2 years have already gone. So we are right in the middle of that. And just a very structural comment, if we look at this as the mainstream to our common goal, we realize that particularly at the finalization and acceptance of the IGAP last year, there were many persons who claimed, or societies who claimed everything for themselves, for their purpose. And the first message is that we need to unite many of the forces to get the same common goal. If we look over the time stream, and I come to that in a minute, we also have to realize that during the development, there will also be sidelines or maybe separate lines, and it will be our task of the steering activities of IGAP to put this together in the targeting the common goal. And I believe, from my personal perspective, that the WHO Brain Health Unit will have a leading, or has and will have a leading role in this important part. Next slide. One thing that we all know and has been mentioned already and will be mentioned again is, of course, the World Bank classification of the world, but I think it's more correct now to say the North-South divide, which divides the world in somehow socio-economic, more comfortable areas and less areas. And of course, depending on that, the availability of funds, the availability of resources determines many aspects of health. Next. So I think, and I think you've heard it, and you will hear it again, that the WHO is developing a so-called toolkit. And this toolkit is aimed to help us to introduce IGAP into the global regions. Symbolically, on the right side, I put here 3 things, and definitely a toolkit for a low-income country will be different as a toolkit for socio-economic settled countries with structures, and will be different even in highly organized countries where the expectations of IGAP will be in a different direction. And we do hope that this finalization of the toolkit will help to implement the IGAP even more and bring it to the attention of the WHO members worldwide. Next one. So if we look at the IGAP, and Professor Guekht has already shown that in more detail the three departments, and I have it up here too, we can say the north, so to say, the rich part of the world, definitely needs advocacy, the southern part even more. I think the IGAP worry about therapy and prevention will be less expressed in the northern part, but it will be very much needed in the southern part. And we also will present a so-called needs registry at the World Congress, which is done by our former president, to show what is available in which part of the regions. And I also want to remind that the essential medicine list, which is also issued by the WHO, is a very important part, which we need to be aware of. If we look at innovation and research, I think we'd look at different things. If you look at the northern part, innovation would mean change, look for studies, look for molecules, innovate. If you look innovation and research in low-income countries, this would be the implementation, perhaps, of different ways of research and different ways of activities. But alike, the topic is the same, but the content will be different. And of course, for both, and I think as physicians, we can never learn enough and we can never emphasize enough. We need to be more involved in policy and we need to be more involved in public health, as those structures create the area in which we work. Next. So what does the World Federation of Neurology do? And I try to symbolize this with a picture from top down. We are non-state actors in regard to the WHO and also now to the United Nations. ECOSOC, United Nations ECOSOC will be known by you by the editor or the creator of the SDGs, just to refer to SDG 1. We have a very close connection with the WHO. We're also supporting the development of the toolkit, and we are very much devoted to the introduction of this important aspect by the WHO. We promote the IGAP at all levels. There's hardly any talk from any trustee, any lecture from any trustee, any publication that does not concern the IGAP. And I think this is something that all of us must do. We must promote it. And I'm often surprised in countries which I need actually, like in Asia and Africa, how little people have taken up this important key message of the IGAP. It has also been mentioned that one large activity is brain health, and the World Federation has already started a brain health campaign in 2020, and which has actually created a big avalanche of interest. We have also now the WHO creating and publishing on brain health. There are several societies, there's the European Academy and also the American Academy of Neurology, who are really into brain health. And I personally think that brain health is more, let's say, the trajectory of our activities. And the IGAP is well embedded into brain health. We have the intention to publish, and we do that, and we have some publications on brain health, and just to make it as a reference able source. And I think that's what our members need if they deal with politicians or if they deal with their societies. And we also have World Brain Days. Last year was brain health. This year is brain health and disability. I'll speak about that in a second. And this is important as such brain health initiative give the initiative to regions to foster neurology. Next slide. So this is this year's World Brain Day, and the topic is brain health and disability. And the second thought or main thought is leave no one behind. We have again invited our regions. So it's not done with the individual society, but with the regions. And we have also invited the WFNR, the World Federation of Neurorehabilitation. And in the past month have created a lingo, and we've created a summary of intentions. If you're interested in that, please look at our website, and there's a toolbox to download and also exciting slides you might use for your own purpose in regard to promoting brain health and disability. The topic this year is exciting because I also think in this respect that it will not remain, a disability will not remain just a word, but disability should be, from the point of neurology, it's more defined and more described. And we cannot stop to mention history where disability was not only a stigma, but also prohibitive for many people. And we all know to what disaster this thinking, this school of thinking led in the last century. It is also important to know, and I'm sure all countries have signed that, but disability is not an affair for charity. It is definitely too, but it's a human right. And to bring the human right and this acknowledgement along is also an important task. Next one. So one thing that we must consider is if we have a long time between now and 23, well, not so long, actually, 2 years have almost passed, we must consider that in these coming years, there will be developmental changes in health systems, in drugs, in content. From the societies, all of us will not be here when it's 2031. So we have to be careful in our personal management of IGAP that our values, traditions, and developments are carried forward by the next generation. And of course, we have to be careful, and we must be aware that many things that we do are subject to the contemporary thinking. And with a German word for it, it's called Zeitgeist, which means that judging one time of a period from another time of period is not correct. You always have to look from the time period. So in the moment, I say it would be the influences of climate change would be a very contemporary issue that's missing nowhere. But this is something we have to look into our future work. Next slide. So I propose to end not like we do with our present forward mindset, that we make a plan from 2022 to 24 to 25 to 2030 and 31, but to do the other way around, and that's called a future back approach, where you look at the end and say, what should we have achieved in 2031? Next slide. So from my personal perspective, looking at this approach, I think the toolkit should be available from this year. Then during the time we should have made dynamic adaptations to changes of structures. We should, if we look back from 2031, have introduced it into all WHO chapters, into all WHO member states. We look back at common goals. We should involve not only neurology, but also neurosciences and related health groups, which I call here multi-stakeholders, patients and carers. And of course, we should by then be clear on the needs and also have changed the needs or reduced them, in other words. With that, next slide. I thank you very much and show again the slide from our next World Congress of Neurology, which will take place in Montreal this year. And there will be also joint activities with the ILAE, and there will also be joint activities in regard to the IGAP and to brain health. With that, thank you. And I have now the great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Helen, who is a pediatric neurologist in London and the current president of the International League Against Epilepsy. Please, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, and thank you for that overview. So now to move to what, as the International League Against Epilepsy, we have done and are trying to do towards enabling IGAP over the next 10 years. Next slide. The International League Against Epilepsy is the global professional organisation for those individuals who care for those with epilepsy, as in the sense of medically looking after them. And it's present in over 129 country chapters, present in excess of 160 countries and territories around the world. What we are looking at is to try and achieve our vision, not least a world where no person's life is limited by epilepsy. In 2020, we launched our new strategy for the next 10 years, our strategy 2030, which obviously is looking focused at moving towards that vision and completing our mission. And that is composed of 5 specific goals, not least in standards and best practice, education, advocacy, research and innovation, and organizational viability, as well as cross-cutting themes of congresses and events, communication and publications to try and enable in all of those areas. And overall, looking towards achieving what we feel is a realistic target of 70, 80, 90. 70% of those treated achieving seizure control, 80% of people with epilepsy having access to appropriate, affordable, safe anti-seizure medications, and 90% of all people with epilepsy being aware of their diagnosis as a treatable brain disorder. Next slide, please. So with the Intersectoral Global Action Plan, approved by all 192 member states of the World Health Assembly in May of last year, we have global agreement that we need to move forward with this global action plan. And over the subsequent 12 months, the WHO formulated with specific expertise the epilepsy technical brief, providing, highlighting the issues there and providing levers and tools for change. And how we see these two things is providing a key to unlock political motivation with regard to, and political momentum with regard to moving forward in enhancing the care of those with epilepsy. And certainly they focus on the 5 strategic objectives as have been highlighted by the Alla at the beginning, within which are 10 targets. Next slide. And it's actually looking, I'm not going to go over the summary as is so eloquently put forward with regards to the Global Action Plan for Epilepsy and Other Neurological Disorders as put forward by Alla, but I'm going to focus on the 10 global targets and how we are going to move forward in trying to enable that. Next slide. So what we recognized is that in the initial phase, there needs to be a degree of preparation, not least informing everybody about what the Intersectoral Global Action Plan is, but also to try and get an understanding, particularly at a country level, about what is required. So our first degree of preparation has been a chapter survey. So survey gone out to countries to understand the level of readiness and establish data against, or what's existing against each of the 10 targets. We recognise also that there needs to be a degree of communication at a country level with ministries of health and trying to provide tools of how and help with how they may engage with their Ministry of Health to discuss appropriate target for increasing service coverage and where the International League can assist. We need in this preparation phase to raise awareness of the opportunities of working together to achieve these targets, and we're also working towards a step-by-step guide to support chapters in their work at a country level to achieve these targets. And this will be formulated as what we call a gateway to resources that will be available through a website, a manual, if you like, of what can take place and what may help towards achieving the targets. And another gateway, the second one of our gateways, is to provide information of what projects are being undertaken at a country level. This has already been formulated as a database. It's moving towards being a gateway to which people can upload and also find out about what's happening at a country level with regard to innovative projects that may move us forward in achieving the IGAP targets. We do have a third gateway that will be our gateway to education, which has already been ongoing and existing through our ILAE Academy. Next slide. Next slide. So initially, as I've indicated, we have undertaken the initial survey, and this really is to give a snapshot about where we are with the individual targets. And you'll see that actually only 5 out of the 6 regions are listed. This is because this is work in progress. And at the time this particular heat map was produced, we only had information from one country in the North American region, and that was actually one Caribbean island. So that's work still being undertaken, but we do have data from in excess of 100 countries so far. But what this illustrates, even in a broad sense, if bearing in mind red means really bad, there's no information, green is good. Really, for most targets, there is not a lot going on. And specifically that, for example, most countries do not have specific plans in place for epilepsy care. The anti-seizure medicines, there are parts of the world where they really are not being not available. There's only 2 regions where you'd say that most countries actually had a good availability. There's a real issue about what data there is available with regard to epilepsy services and healthcare coverage. The epilepsy really doesn't arise on the agenda of many of the countries. You can see that's target 5.1. It's interesting that for disability law, that appears to be green, but I think that's more of a misunderstanding about what that involves and perhaps isn't as good as that perhaps seen. Next slide. So what about the targets, and where are we and where are we going? So first of all, if we look at strategic objective 1 and look at the targets, target 1.1, 75% of countries include epilepsy and other neurological disorder in their national plans. And the second target, 100% having awareness campaign or an advocacy program. What we can see is that as we moved towards joint working and recognizing this is an action plan for epilepsy and other neurological disorders, epilepsy actually provides a good entry point for building stronger neurological services in some areas of the world more than others, but certainly can be used as a lever. If we have a good service with regard to epilepsy, then that can be transposed to stronger neurological services overall. And what we're in the progress of doing is providing the step-by-step manual for developing national epilepsy plan. We already had advocacy programs going on from a central level. We have the International Epilepsy Day jointly with the International Bureau for Epilepsy, as well as other advocacy events. And as I'm sure we'll hear later, the International Bureau for Epilepsy are producing an advocacy toolkit. Next slide, please. The second objective, but with the 2 targets again, that 75% of countries include epilepsy and other neurological disorders as part of universal healthcare coverage. And the second target, 80% of countries having access to essential medicines and technology. So we want to aim for that epilepsy should be included in benefit packages to reduce out-of-pocket expenditure for individuals. And what we will want to do is invest in cases to show the cost benefit of doing this. We also will undertake landscape surveys to find out where we really are with essential medicines, but not only essential medicines, but with regard to technology, with regard to diagnostics. We need to address the WHO essential medicine and emergency medicines list in each country. There may be the essential list, but is that really what's seen in each individual country? And provide guidance on the use of generic medicines. Next slide. Prevention and promotion of brain health. Well, what the two targets here, 80% of countries having an intersectoral brain health promotion and prevention program, and target 2, global prevention targets met. As has already been illustrated in Alla's talk, 25% of the epilepsies, particularly in lower middle income countries, are preventable, whether it be due to stroke, other cerebrovascular disease, or traumatic perinatal issues, or indeed traumatic brain injury. So what we can look at is integrating stroke prevention into epilepsy programs and prevention of epilepsy into other neurological and non-communicable disease programs, as well as exploring other epilepsy-specific prevention opportunities. Next slide. The 4 strategic objectives with, again, 2 targets based on research and innovation and strengthened information systems. 80% of countries routinely collect and report core data sets, and doubling of the output of global research. I think it's read as 100% increase in global output of research, considering that actually that just means doubling, however little or as much is being undertaken. So we want to aim for updating the global status report for neurology and look at seeking through our epidemiological mission prevalence, incidence and service coverage surveys, looking at baselines for targets for each individual country in a much more detailed fashion than we've been able to do so far. And as regards the research, we've got the gateway to innovative projects for that to be explored, for people to share. We are producing or about to submit a Lancet Commission on Research Priorities that has been worked on over the past 2 to 3 years. And we, of course, have our journals and publications to publicize research and make that research more accessible. Next slide. And finally, the 5th objective, which was epilepsy specific, countries to increase epilepsy service coverage by 50%, and 80% of countries reviewed with regard to the legislation to protect rights of people with epilepsy. We need to understand the disparities of care, and we need to look at that with regard to individual countries, particularly with regard to unmet needs and gaps in services. We need to enhance training and education at whatever level. We recognize there is a shortage of neurologists in many countries in the world, not least in Africa. And it may be that different kinds of professionals, we need to be enhancing their education, particularly healthcare workers. Developing people-centered care pathways. We recognize that there is not a set standard evidence-based care pathway with regard to epilepsy, and that is something that we have put in motion with regard to development. So that can be used as a gold standard in moving forward, as well as improving reach through telehealth and digital transformation, and looking at rights and legislative changes in individual countries. Next slide. So what do these targets mean overall for epilepsy? Well, there are targets that mean that we're going to close the treatment gap, other targets that close the inclusion gap, and of course, that's where we're trying to double the research, closing the research gap, as well as the supporting targets about enhancing national plans, policies, and strategies to include epilepsy, the core set of epilepsy-related indicators, as well as looking at intersectoral brain health promotion and prevention. Next slide, please. So, but we all recognize that whatever we do at a central level and regional level, what will really matter is what's happening at a country level. So we need to support chapters in moving forward in developing country-specific plans, and we've condensed this into an acronym so that they have their own EPI-ACT plans, looking at engagement, plans for national plans and investment for service prevention research, information, access, care pathways, training and education. So that as we move forward, particularly over the next 5 years, but so that at the end of 10 years, we really will have achieved what we set out to do. Next slide, please. and really have that target of 70, 80, 90, utilising IGAP to move towards this. 70% of those treated achieving adequate seizure control, 80% of people with epilepsy having access to appropriate, affordable, safe anti-seizure medicines, and 90% of all people with epilepsy being aware of their diagnosis as a treatable brain disorder. The Intersectoral Global Action Plan for Epilepsy and Other Neurological Disorders does provide a key with all the targets that it has set for us to unlock the discussion with ministers of health in really being able to move forward with this and achieve these goals, realistic goals for 2031. It is our role, in sense, as central ILAE, to provide tools for countries to administer this at a local level. So with that, I'd like to now move on to introduce Dr. Francesca Sofia, President of the International Bureau for Epilepsy, our parallel patient organization. She is also a mother of a child with epilepsy, so knows at first hand what this is all about. So over to you, Francesca. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. And yeah. Okay. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and thanks for listening to today's webinar. Next slide, please. I have the honor to represent the community of people with epilepsy in this webinar. The IBE is the only global voice of people with epilepsy. It has a membership of 150 chapters across the world. Chapters are organizations led by people with epilepsy, their family members, in specific countries. As I said, in many countries, as many as 100, even more countries are represented in our membership. IBE has a long history, and in recent years, he's experiencing the opportunities that IGAP is providing. The historical approval of the 10-year intersectoral global action plan on epilepsy and other neurological disorders represented an unprecedented opportunities actually for IBE to better serve our community by beginning early on to align our strategic priorities and operational plan with the IGAP targets. In other words, what we did on the approval of IGAP was to devise and launch a brand new strategic plan whose initiatives in it were inspired by IGAP targets and nurtured by the vision that by 2031 we will have attained a transformational social change for people with epilepsy worldwide. What is it to a transformational social change for people with epilepsy? It is exactly what is highlighted in this slide. It's 90% of all people with epilepsy that are aware of their diagnosis as a treatable brain disorder. It is 80% of people with epilepsy that have access to appropriate, affordable, safe anti-seizure medications. It is 70% of people with epilepsy on treatment that achieve adequate seizure control. But most of all, it is all people with epilepsy that experience an improvement in their quality of life, in their overall quality of life, because epilepsy is much more than a health condition, as you have heard from the previous speaker. Next slide, please. So we took the opportunity to devise this new strategic plan, which revolves around 4 main action areas that are advocacy and awareness raising, capacity building, partnership development, and knowledge creation and exchange. In other words, our plan is full of initiatives that are into these 4 areas. And these activities and areas will have an impact on IGAP targets, on the cascade targets, and also on many UN SDGs. I don't need to go into the specific IGAP targets because you've heard about the targets from the previous speakers, but those that are most impacted by our strategic plan are target 1 and of course target 5, 1.1, 1.2, 5.1 and 5.2. Next slide, please. So, previous one. Yeah. Regarding our first area of action, which is awareness raising, target 1 and target 5 of IGAP demand that stigma around epilepsy and all neurological disorders be dismantled. So we at IBE run specific campaigns every year to really address the issue of stigma. One is on the occasion of the International Epilepsy Day every year in February, and the other one is the 50 Million Steps campaign. This year, both campaigns were connected through the theme of overcoming stigma and dispelling misconceptions about epilepsy. You wonder why this is needed and what stigma is. You've heard the details, the medical details, and the current definitions of stigma. I would like to provide you with a glimpse at the reality of stigma. It is my 13-year-old daughter who was not admitted in any summer camps this year, not even those for children with general disabilities, because people there do not know how to manage seizures. They don't know what a seizure entails and how a children or a person experiencing a seizure should be handled. Can you think that my daughter, and I wonder how many like her, is spending her summer alone at home? Can we live with this level of loneliness and desperation that ignorance and stigma lead to? This is what we are here to address. And when we speak about IGAP, this is exactly an example of what we aim to avoid and to dismantle for the future and in the next 10 years. Next slide, please. And that's why we need more global awareness. Days and weeks, we need to tell more true stories of real people with epilepsy, like my daughter, but also like Cassidy Megan, the girl in this, in the first cartoon in this slide, who was able to overcome stigma and to champion the cause of epilepsy for the benefit of the whole community by creating the amazing Purple Day on Epilepsy. Along this line, the IBE is carrying out several awareness initiatives, such as the campaign on women and epilepsy, which is another very important and peculiar issue associated with epilepsy. And we are taking also every possible opportunity to put epilepsy in the spotlight, such as during the Brain Awareness Week or the Health Day of the WHO, the World Health Day. So we try to leverage these opportunities and occasions to really position epilepsy at the center of the global conversation around health. Next slide, please. What I think is one of the most remarkable features of the IGAP is its person-centered nature. Throughout this document, you get a sense that the plan is truly inspired by and rooted in the needs of people living with neurological disorders and in their perspectives. Clearly, for an organization like IBE, this is a strong call to action to do even more to engage our community and speak their voice. And we are doing that by gathering a community council, which was recently launched, and whose members are people with epilepsy and family members who from across the world who have accepted to contribute their experiences and perspectives to our common cause. Another similar initiative, but more targeted to young people with epilepsy, is the IBE Global Youth Team, which is made by young people with epilepsy and in some ways tries to engage young people and to renew the way we talk around epilepsy. We are doing even more. We are looking at the other people beyond those living with epilepsy who are strongly impacted by epilepsy, the family members, parents, siblings, and the other members and relatives are all impacted when there is a child or a person in a family who lives with epilepsy. Everyone in the family is affected. So we are exploring this by interviewing families, and this is an effort that was promoted by our youth team actually, and is providing a brand new perspective on the reality of the people who live with epilepsy. Next slide, please. So one of the action areas I mentioned earlier, which is part of our strategic plan, concerns knowledge, and specifically knowledge creation and sharing, because we believe that knowledge is power, and we believe that by providing knowledge and skills to people with epilepsy and their carers, we will be able to speak a better voice, to do a better job, to bring epilepsy out of the shadow and position it within the conversation around public health, global public health. So as a way to strengthen our community and the people with epilepsy, make them more able of representing themselves and their needs and perspectives, we are devising a series of e-learning modules. The first one on health diplomacy was recently launched, and these are meant to train people with epilepsy to become really effective advocates and be able to make their voice heard effectively. We also did another similar effort with the IGAP Unpacked Guide, since we believe IGAP is a unique powerful tool we wanted to be understood by all people with epilepsy across the world so that they can find meaning and leaders within this plan. Next slide, please. I can skip this one. Okay, so much of our portfolio of initiatives is designed to enable IGAP implementation, as you're hearing, and to achieve the goal and the vision of a transformational social change for people with epilepsy by 2032. But here you see a summary, a scheme of the ongoing program at the global level for advocacy. Advocacy takes much of our effort and time these days. We have been working on several activities that lie in these four main blocks. First, awareness raising, and I told you about some of our campaigns around awareness raising. We are also working towards evidence generation. We will be launching a global epilepsy needs survey next year to collect real life data directly from people and families living with epilepsy to make a real life case for epilepsy in the global public health conversation. We're also doing a mapping exercise to really collect information on the regional legislative regulations and to become really able to identify the gaps in the legislations that IGAP can help us to address and fill. And we are working towards capacity building. We are trying to provide our chapters and the whole epilepsy community with toolkits and training modules, as I said, to make them better advocates and be able to contribute effectively to the conversation and the progress around epilepsy. Next slide. So in this slide and a couple of others, you see a spotlight on specific plans and activities we're running in specific regions of the world. Here is the African region, where in order to facilitate, enable IGAP implementation, we started to gather face-to-face stakeholder meetings. One will be held by the end of this year in Ethiopia and will be a multi-stakeholder IGAP conference involving not only IBE and its African representatives, but also the ILAE, the World Health Organization, AFRO, and the African Union representatives. This is meant to be an occasion for capacity building and training for our chapters and the whole epilepsy community. We are also funding some small projects in the African region, the trendsetter projects and the stigma reduction projects. A few countries, a few chapters have been given small funds to really pilot ideas and initiatives that if effective will be scaled up at the regional level. And we are also preparing a documentary in Kenya, which will be launched at the end of this year. Next slide, please. Similar activities are ongoing in the Americas with face-to-face workshops. One was held in Santiago, Chile, this year, and there were many stakeholders participating in this event, which set a milestone in our plan to implement IGAP in the region. We are also starting our mapping exercise in the region, and we are actively translating IBE resources like the e-learning modules, the IGAP guide into Spanish, because we are aware that language can be a huge barrier in our community, and we need to overcome that. Next slide. And again, also, I can skip this one, because we're running out of time. And again, similar activities also are being conducted in Southeast Asia. We are about to travel to India for a face-to-face workshop, which will be held in Jaipur, together with ICNA, ILAE, and One Neurology. And we are also starting our country legislative mapping report. And during the meeting in Jaipur, we will be featuring epilepsy and society in the era of IGAP. This is a symposium which will see many interactive sessions and panel discussions on inclusion, treatment, research, and prevention gaps. And there will be also many testimonials and people with lived experience who will share their perspectives. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, IGAP provided us with a unique, unprecedented opportunity to really champion the cause of epilepsy, finally, after centuries of neglect. But there is more than, making epilepsy a public health priority in IGAP. IGAP provides the ground for something that has a wider impact, is going to have a wider impact. It is a ground where competition and division will be dismissed, and communities affected by many diverse neurological conditions will come together, will find a common ground to promote better health for all. With this goal in mind and the opportunity of IGAP, the One Neurology partnership was born. This is a way to promote people-centered advocacy with a unified voice among all communities affected by neurological disorders. In this, epilepsy can rightly be a strategic entry point, as it has been proposed to be within the IGAP itself. And we think that One Neurology can provide a transformative means to really find solutions that will benefit many people, many more people than those living with epilepsy. That's why IBE joined the One Neurology partnership, and our CEO, Donna Walsh, was recently elected chair of the One Neurology partnership, because we truly believe, next slide, that IGAP implementation can be accelerated if we work together. We are already in a pretty good shape. There's a number of organizations that come together within one neurology, and several organizations deal with diseases that are different from epilepsy, like Alzheimer's disease or headache and many others. So you see here something unique is happening thanks to IGAP and thanks to the generosity of the people and the organizations who have led to this historical approval, this historical plan. You've heard I have a daughter with epilepsy, but I'm sure I won't see a better future for my daughter if it will be only for her and for those like her. I see many opportunities in our extended group and community working together. And thanks to all those who made it possible, including the speakers who spoke before me, who were part of this extraordinary delegation of advocates who really effectively championed the cause of epilepsy and other neurological disorders until today, relentlessly. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca, for that very personal view, as well as the view for the International Bureau for Epilepsy. So now we move to a question and answer session. We have 15 minutes that we're able to do this. So if I can ask all our speakers to turn on their cameras. We have several questions in the question and answers. The first I'm going to put to the panel: in the burden of epilepsy or neurological disorders and treatment gaps are higher in the lower and middle income countries. However, this is obviously where there's also a dearth of neurologists. And so it may be they feel challenging to achieve the strategic objectives and reduce the treatment gap because of the lack of specialist knowledge. What can we do about this, and what plans may there be in place? Wolfgang, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, gladly. Thank you very much. I think this, let's say, difference in manpower is a very important point that has been developed historically, and this is not something one can do in one strike. And even if I think if we doubled, we calculated once, if we doubled the number of training positions and the number of persons in 1 year and 2 years, which is probably not possible, this would not change things dramatically. I think there are three things. One thing, and this is something which the World Federation is engaged in, is to promote education. That sounds very simple, but education is not education of doctors, but education is also the education of primary care persons, of nurses, of medical officers that deal with patients with epilepsy. The second one is, of course, training, and we have started our teaching center, which is just a little thing for Africa when it started in 2013. But since that time, in quite a number of regions of Africa, I use Africa as an example because we have most experience here, many other universities turn up and use neurology. And this is something like a crystallizing effect that the training and the resources should be used in the country. And one of our strategies in that is to empower the region in order to teach. This is one thing. This third thing. And the further thing is that, of course, we have discovered, or not discovered is not the right word, we have implemented more ways of communication with M-learning, with strategies that are also usable in poor countries, and education is something that we all have to foster. So I have no miracle answers. I repeat, education, e-learning and M-learning, and as third point, I think the most important point is that we don't go teaching and colonizing, but we empower the regions to produce their own teaching activities, and also that we must include also a primary care and health workers in our targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. And I'd like to emphasize, the need for education is something that we want to empower, but also it's not just targeting clinician, medically qualified, there are the healthcare workers as well. There are projects undergoing in several African countries about aiding tools with regard to that, with regard to diagnosis, and also ensuring essential medicines are on lists and are available. And that's work that's ongoing jointly with the WHO as well. So there are several areas that, we appreciate neurologists are in short supply, but it's actually making sure that others maybe who are involved in the diagnosis and treatment of epilepsy have the appropriate tools as well. And working in partnership also with the IBE, there's the issue about advocating for engaging with governments to improve those resources. And that's another way forward. Okay, so sorry. So the other another comment. There have been some mentions of several surveys from different organisations. Are they being collated collectively, or a summary of the collective responses themes being considered? I think there's different levels of surveys, and at the present time they've gone out to different individuals. I think we have done a baseline survey in the International League with regard to epilepsy to the chapters, so to the ILAE chapters, the professional organisation. We've had constant communication with the IBE and are aware of their survey, which is not overlapping. But of course, it's something that we need to look at combining data where it's appropriate and look at where the needs are. So there's no way we want to overlap, and we don't want to give everybody survey overload. But at the present time, I think most of the surveys are going to different individuals to get different information. Do you have anything to add to that?
I would just like to add,
carry on.
Sorry. Just one, 2 sentences, and this is not a real survey, but we have done the questionnaire among our members and delegates in the last month, and the interest and the knowledge, interested may not be the right word, but the knowledge was strikingly little. So we had our first survey, had out of 123 members, we had only about 10% answer. And then after the second time, it went up to 20%. So we know we have to spread the news, and we are still a little bit faint because we don't have the right tools to do that. But I think this is our next mission. Thank you.
Thanks. There's a couple of questions about funding. And of course, always things like this, it's always the $1 million question. Well, and that's not supposed to be a pun, but anyway, about how can we get funding to implement this? And I think there's 2 aspects. Number one, there isn't an unlimited pot of money, and there isn't new pots of money for this. The WHO doesn't come with money. We don't necessarily come with money that can implement. But what we can do is look at projects that have been done, look at projects which are ongoing, look and try and advocate for where money might be appropriate. And also in the way we work, look at budgeting some money for key areas that are going to give a global reach. So support our chapters. So for example, in the toolkits, etc., that we're also looking at. So it's a sort of multi-pronged approach. There isn't a pot of money just to produce, but certainly there will be some areas where money will be needed, and we need to look at that, and also look at how we can support applications for money for perhaps local projects. Francesca, do you want to comment?
Yeah. This, as you said, $1 million question, and it's always difficult to answer questions about money. My experience being a member of a patient organization is that lay organizations have been struggling to get donations and support from the public, donors, industries, governments, and as many funders as possible. They have been competing among each other for funds. and with other conditions, communities have been competing. To me, what I can see from my angle of observation, from my perspective, is that we really have to change our paradigm. We started from the assumption that we are championing a very good cause, and so we should deserve support and donations. But we now need to prove that the services, projects, and initiatives that we are promoting, we are running, are really economically effective, can provide saving, can improve lives, can improve health and social systems. This is where I think the new game of fundraising will lie in the future, and I believe that we will need to train our communities and our chapters to become better at presenting in the most effective way their activities, in the sense that these are sustainable and impactful and can really improve society as a whole and the health system, not just looking for support. I don't think it's going to work anymore.
Thank you. There is also a question about the fact that, you know, there is a differential of diagnostic services and treatments across different countries available. You know, and you can look at resource-rich countries or high income countries. They've got everything available. I'm not saying their care pathways are completely right in some instances. And then you've got low middle income countries where their resources aren't there. They only have the least expensive drugs. And someone's asked whether there's any where you could provide a first aid kit that was common for all patients with epilepsy. And I think I've got a two-pronged interest in that. Number one, of course, there is what we have looked at is the fact that when there is a crisis in an individual country, there is an acute shortage, and there are those organisations that go in immediately, not least the WHO, to provide emergency care. And what we've determined is the emergency kits that go in don't necessarily have a supply of, I think they have emergency rescue medication, but they don't necessarily have a supply of anti-epileptic seizure medications. And that's something, you know, by joining the health cluster, we want to advocate for that and make sure that, but that's in the short term in acute emergencies. What we have to bear in mind is epilepsy, as other neurological disorders, are chronic diseases. And, you know, that needs ongoing supported care. So an acute sticking plaster isn't necessarily what is going to work. And therefore, this is the way we want to engage with ministers of health to make sure that epilepsy and other neurological disorders are in their healthcare plans and moving forward, and to make sure of universal healthcare coverage. Does anyone else want to reply to that?
I think I can only underline what you say. I think it's also very important that we focus on the new development of the essential medicine list for the future, because that's, let's say, a basic structure that is supported by the WHO and recommended to its members what should be there. And if I look at epilepsy, it is sufficient, but it could be better. And I think as new drugs come, also newer drugs become more inexpensive, some of them. So I think that we have to really focus on that and put this into the minds of the policymakers of those countries in need. Thank you.
So one final point, I think, one final question, a question really, and it may be Francesca or someone who wants to say something. There's no doubt laws do exist against discrimination, and that may be in our survey, you could see generally green in that with regard to across the regions, but it doesn't guarantee that they are followed. You know, what more can we do to measure and eventually change the discrimination of people with epilepsy experience and perhaps other neurological disorders in daily life? It's probably, yeah, I need to ask for a brief answer, but I'm not sure it can be brief, Francesca.
No, it's a tough question. So I think that we should keep doing what we are just doing, keep talking about epilepsy. Can you hear me?
No, the sound of your sound is going, I think, Francesca. Really sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's back now. It's back.
Oh,
Try
okay.
again.
Okay. So what I was saying is
Francesca, it's going again. I'm really sorry.
that's okay. I'm sorry.
Alla,
Apologies.
do you want to say something?
Yeah, Helen, thank you. Actually, we have excellent examples. I know that now Latin American colleagues are listening to us, like Carlos Achiveda, and there are several very effective projects aiming on decreasing of stigma, and they were very successful. I would like to highlight the well-known project Stand Up for Epilepsy that was jointly organized by the ILAE and IB, and the role of Nico Moshe in this project. And indeed, for instance, our survey demonstrated that even in the educated community, about 30% were afraid of even being close to the person with epilepsy. I think education and projects aiming on demonstration of absolute, I would say, excellent personal and knowledge and understanding, and aiming on bringing people with epilepsy close to all our activities is the main tool to decrease stigma. And definitely we need to work with media. As we all know, there are, I would say, inappropriate examples in a number of movies and so on. So I think we need, well, we can do nothing with them, but we need to address it. So I think that, again, multi-sectorial projects, including not only doctors working with people with epilepsy, but all the medical professionals, and definitely people with epilepsy and many other neurological disorders will help. And finally, I would like to note that this is also valid as an entry point for many other neurological disorders. We know stigma for people with Parkinson's disease, and that's also quite inappropriate. So once again, we should address it as a, I would say, global unmet need to decrease stigma for people with epilepsy and many other neurological disorders, joining our forces there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to really thank our speakers, Wolfgang Grisold from the World Federation for Neurology, Alla Guekht from the World Federation for Neurology and the International League Against Epilepsy, and Francesca Sofia from the International Bureau for Epilepsy. Thank you for your inputs. I hope everybody has enjoyed it. The discussion has been great. I wish you, please remember, bear in mind, this will be available for recording if anybody wishes to listen subsequently. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much for organizing. Thank you.